So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Elizabeth Ewan. Elizabeth is a recently retired professor of history and Scottish studies from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and that's where she's beaming in from today. And she's also recently become an honorary visiting professor at the Centre for History at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and we're very honoured to have her as in that role. For any students or scholars of medieval and early modern Scotland, Elizabeth is a well-known and respected name for her work on women's and gender history in pre-modern Scotland. She also has a keen interest and many publications focusing on urban history and crime in the same period in Scotland. She'll be drawing some of these specialisms together in her talk this evening, titled A Brewing Storm, Alewives in 16th Century Inverness, and I shall hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks very much for that very kind introduction, and also for the invitation to speak on a topic that is close to my heart and probably close to many people's heart, ale. I'll start by sharing my screen, I hope. Yes, okay. You can see that all right? Excellent, okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. What I'm going to talk about today is about the women of 16th century Inverness, especially those that are brewed ale. And I remembered after I started working on this that I do actually have a sort of a personal connection with these women. And if there's time at the end, I'll show you a little aspect of that. Now, people in Scotland have been drinking for a very long time, as we can see from this Pictish stone. So what I'm going to talk about today, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the sources that I've been using. Then I'll talk about women and brewing more generally. Then we'll go on to the regulation of brewing, which is where these women really show up. And then finally, I don't know if you had a chance to read the longer blurb about the talk, I'd like to focus in on a particular brewer by the name of Elspeth Barnet, who had a particularly colourful career. She had a very forceful personality, and this resulted in her appearing frequently before the church courts. And this meant that she was visible to historians 500 years later. And it's through the lives of people like Elspeth Barnet that we can get a glimpse of women's lives in 16th century Inverness as they earned their living, married, and formed households, and best of all, to my mind at any rate, broke the law. But I'd like to start off with an incident which occurred in Inverness in 1566. So I'm going to take you back to July 1566 in the center of the town. On 8th of July 1566, Janet Sutherland, the wife of Farquhar McPherson, appeared before the town court with a lamentable tale. She reported that she had been sitting peacefully drinking some ale in the house of John Morrison, apparently an alehouse, and minding her own business, or as the scribe noted it in the somewhat more formal language of the law, suspecting no evil but to have lived under God's peace, our sovereigns, and yours. In other words, she was a law-abiding, peaceful citizen. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Elspeth Barnet, John Morrison's wife, and Marion Ogilvy, the wife of John Abraham, cruelly attacked her, pulling her hair, scratching her face, and insulting her. They called her a common thief's brat and alleged that her mother was a common thief who broke into barns and lived on whelks out of the sea, i.e. that she was poverty-stricken. Now, Janet was pregnant, and she complained that the two women had assaulted her so severely that that night she almost lost the child she was carrying, as another woman, the wife of Jasper Dempster, could testify. She then appointed Jasper Dempster himself to plead her case for her. Now, Jasper focused on Elspeth Barnet, reminding the court that she had frequently been in trouble before and had been threatened with banishment if she did not mend her ways. He asked that they banish her now, or at least if they did not, to provide some other remedy. Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvie both personally appeared before the court and denied Jonat's charges. After hearing witnesses and ignoring Jasper Dempster's plea, the judges found Elspeth innocent, a fact that her husband, John Morrison, asked to be recorded in writing. Given her reputation, as we will see, this was probably a wise move. In the eyes of the court, Marion was the one to blame, and they convicted her of striking Janet, pulling her hair, and calling her a common thief's brat. However, it turned out that there was rather more to the story. Despite Janet presenting herself as the innocent victim, Marion Ogilvie brought a counterclaim saying that she, Marion, had gone to her sister's house to do some business and that Janet Sutherland had been drinking there. Janet Sutherland seemed to be drinking in quite a few places in 1566 in Inverness. Janet insulted Marion, calling her a common whore and thief, and then struck her with her hands and fists before wounding her in the head with a bi-crook, an iron hook that was probably hanging over the fire, drawing a great quantity of her blood. More witnesses were heard, and Janet was convicted of the assault. Concerned about Janet's pregnancy, the judges asked Marion's husband, John Abraham, to give surety that he would come before the court again on behalf of his wife to face more serious charges should Janet lose the child. In the event this did not happen, but the whole affair is a reminder that women were just as capable as men of using physical violence on their opponents. Now, as we can see, alehouses could be dangerous places, not just for the customers, but the people who ran them. Elspeth may have been drawn into this fight as the person running the alehouse. We have some other examples of customers attacking alehouse keepers. For example, when another Inverness alewife refused to fill a customer's cup with drink, he struck her on the head with the cup and found himself before the court for assault. Well, what can we learn about women and their roles in Inverness, particularly in the brewing trade, from records such as these? Historians are fortunate, even if Janet Sutherland was not, that both Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvie were women brewers, or brewsters as they were commonly known, and that brewsters were frequently brought before the court for breaking the law, making them more visible than most other women in towns. We can learn quite a lot about the brewing trade in Inverness from these records, and even a little bit about other alcoholic products. Moreover, Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvie were particularly assertive women, imbued with that particular Scottish trait known as smedum, sort of a forthright assertiveness, and well able to look after their own interests. Each had already been involved in a number of violent incidents before, and we shall see that in Inverness, women were no shrinking violets. Although the scribe records the action as taking place in John Morrison's house, it was almost certainly his wife, Elspeth Barnet, who was the alewife running the establishment, brewing the ale, and serving the customers. This sheds some light on the legal status of husbands and wives. Her role is somewhat obscured in this particular record, being hidden behind that of her husband, but we know of her as a brewster from other records. She's also been noted briefly by some local historians, but there's much more to say about her life and work. So what sort of sources do we have to find out about these women? Well, this particular event was recorded by the scribe for the Borough Court of Inverness, the local town court that heard disputes between neighbours, recorded debts, made acts and statutes to govern life and commerce in the town, and handed out fines and other punishments to those who infringed the law. The records of the court and the town council survived for 30 years in the middle and later 16th century, from 1556 to 1586. Now you can get a good sense of the court's activities in the records of Inverness, volume 1, mentioned here, and this map of Inverness in the 16th century comes from that volume. The problem is that the published volume is selected extracts only and only gives roughly about 10% of the total records. So in order to get a fuller picture, it's necessary to look at the originals, which survive in 2 bound volumes in the Highland Archives Centre. Now, if deciphering 16th century handwriting is not really your cup of tea, Inverness is particularly blessed in that from 1899 to 1901, a full transcript was made of both of the 2 original volumes. And all 11 of these volumes, roughly 5,500 pages, are also held in the archive. And I can report that the handwriting is extremely clear. So these make these records actually much more accessible than most town records from this period. Well, how can we use these records? They show individual women and their husbands, regulations controlling brewing, brewers' lists. These are particularly useful for women who are not of elite status. Burgesses and their families made up perhaps 1/3 of the town, but it's the other 2/3 that it's much harder to find from. A particularly useful aspect is the lists of brewers, which appear on a fairly regular basis, especially in the 1570s, and I'll come back to those. I also meant to say that I wanted to thank a former UHI student, Victoria Whitford, for taking photographs of the transcripts and the volumes for me in 2018 after I lost the ones that I had taken when my computer was stolen. And this has been particularly useful given that the closure of the archives in the last two years, or my inability to get to Scotland. Another source is excavations, archaeological information. I'm not able to say quite as much about this at the moment because there's not so much on the brewsters, but it does tell us a lot about life in Inverness in the late Middle Ages and in the 16th century. There was a major excavation on Castle Street in 1979, and I believe that the excavator might actually be in the audience. Was carried out by Jonathan Wordsworth. Unfortunately, for the purposes for the 16th century, the evidence is mostly from the late 13th to 15th centuries, but it does give us a sense of what the town was like and how it was developing. Among the features uncovered was a furnace or an oven, which might possibly have been a kiln for drying corn or malt. There were not any things associated with it, so the evidence makes its function somewhat unclear. From other towns, though, and indeed from some Inverness documents, there are references to kilns in property documents and also occasionally to steep stones, which suggests that malting may have taken place in the backlands of some urban houses. Other excavations and watching briefs have also taken place, and these were summed up in 1998 in an article by David Perry. And I just recently discovered, of course, that there has been excavation this summer by AOC Archaeology, which appears to have uncovered 16th century structures around the site of the old Blackfriars. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about this. So what about women in brewing? Well, brewing was a domestic task, and it was often part-time, and it was part of general women's work. In the earliest surviving Scottish town laws from the 13th century, about 25% of the laws about trading or marketing were concerned with brewing, giving a sense of how important it was. And these laws assumed that the brewers were female. In Scots, the term used was brewster, and that's the term that I will use for most of the rest of this talk, rather than what is perhaps now more familiar today of alewife. Not all brewers were women, and we shall meet some male brewers as well, but the majority of them were. Brewing was a skill which was expected of all adult medieval women. Mothers passed on the skill to their daughters when training them to look after their own households once they grew up. Many young women spent their teenage years working as domestic servants, and they would help with brewing in these households as well. In many ways, brewing was very suited to women's lives. For most married women, the majority of their time was spent in child rearing and caring for the household, clothing, feeding, nursing, and otherwise providing for the needs of their family. Any paid or remunerated work had to be fitted around other domestic responsibilities. The best activities, then, were ones which were extensions of the domestic tasks that they were carrying out anyway. Brewing and selling ale also benefited from other skills that they developed in caring for the household. For example, as purchasers of foodstuffs, as well as sellers of the products of household workshops, women learned market skills, the best places to sell, fluctuations in supply and demand, who were trustworthy suppliers, maybe more importantly, who were not. They had knowledge of local families' needs from friendship networks developed with other women in common tasks such as washing, fetching water, or childcare. The brewing process began with barley, which was then made into malt. In many towns, malting was a separate activity carried out by malt makers, who then sold the malt to the brewsters, although it could be done by the brewsters themselves, but certainly by the 16th century, this seems not to have been very common. Because it was a fairly labor-intensive process, required space and specialized equipment, and could be carried out on a large scale, it tended to be dominated by men who were known as maltmen. And we find several such maltmen active in Inverness in the 16th century. And I suspect that most of them, if they were married, had wives who were brewsters, but I'm still chasing that up. The rest of the brewing process, however, was largely dominated by women. Once women had the malt, they were ready to begin the brewing process. First stage was mashing. Here the malt, and you see this here, was mixed with hot water in a mashing tub to produce wort, the liquid that would form the basis of the ale. And I want to say thank you here to Historic Environment Scotland for allowing me to use this image and also for my talk. We worked on this together when they were coming up with an image of an alewife, and I think they've come up with a rather wonderful one. The malt was mixed with hot water in a mashing tub to produce wort, and this was the liquid that would form the basis of the ale. The malt was stirred with wooden paddles, or mask rudders, as they were known. The paddles also served as excellent weapons if you got into a fight, as we shall see. The wort was then drawn off and placed in a cauldron and boiled, with various additives such as herbs being added to give it flavor. The resulting mixture was then cooled, placed in containers where yeast was added to cause fermentation, and the conversion of the liquid into alcohol took place. Now, this entire process took several days, and the remaining ale was only remained good for a few days. Because of the limitations on preserving ale and the time-consuming process involved in brewing, and this is before hops were really introduced into Scotland and were used as a way of preserving the ale, which by then was called beer. The best way for urban families to supply themselves with ale is for householders to produce it in rotation. A woman would buy more malt than she actually needed for her family, brew it, and then sell the surplus to others. Between brewings, she could use the money she'd made from selling her own ale to purchase ale made by other women for her family. Some women brewed occasionally, selling surplus to their neighbors, but others brewed on a more professional basis, either selling ale to customers who brought their own containers to the house, or running ale houses out of their dwellings and providing seating and perhaps food. And this is probably the type of establishment in which the assaults on Janet Sutherland and Marion Ogilvy took place. Brewing was an option for more than just the Burgess families of the town. While Burgess commercial and trading privileges included the right to brew, those of lesser status could also obtain a yearly license to brew as what were known as unfree brewsters. As a result, brewing was a potentially income-earning activity shared by women from most walks of borough life, although occasionally, in periods of scarcity, the town would limit the number of unfree brewsters who could brew in a particular year. So in 1561, for example, the town decreed that only 21 unfree brewsters were allowed to brew for the next year. And since many others were ordered to stop brewing, This means that there had in fact been far more than 21 brewing at that time. In the 1570s, when more lists were compiled, there were often around 60 to 70 names. So this was a widespread activity. Now, ale, along with bread, was a staple of the medieval and early modern Scottish diet. Because of this, the sale and price were heavily regulated. And the surviving records of Scottish towns, we actually have more records of those brewing ale than those of most other occupations. Although one of the intriguing things about Inverness was that the town made far more statutes about ale than about bread. What particularly this has to say about Inverness, I'll leave up to you. True to form, Elspeth Barnet actually got into one of the bread statutes as well. The town councils regularly set the price of ale, sometimes distinguishing between stronger and weaker ale, or as they sometimes put it, ale or worse ale. In 1561, better ale was to be sold at 8p a quart, and weaker or worse ale at 6p a quart. As in most towns, ale tasters or conners, possibly one of the more popular of local offices, were appointed yearly to test the quality of the ale. In 1561, Inverness ordered that the conners were to pass, each with a bailie, at least twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and more often, if necessary, to test the ale. When someone had ale ready to sell, the conners were summoned to check that the ale was of sufficient quality to be sold at that price, declaring the price once they had tasted the ale. And this image is not a Scottish one, but it shows the ale stick put outside an ale house, indicating that ale was ready to brew, although I don't think that's actually a conner that's actually coming to test it. Despite the rules about quality, the authorities were most concerned that ale be sold at what they thought was a fair price, which varied between 8 or 10p a quart. Those who sold above this price were punished. And most of the women who appear in the court records are charged with selling at too high a price, rather than selling without a license, although some do appear for this as well. The fact that the women that are charged all sell for the same price might suggest that they were selling at what the market could bear. And perhaps there's some evidence of cooperative price fixing going on here. Penalties range from a fine and the confiscation of the ale, which was often then distributed to the poor, to the loss of the right to brew for the rest of the year. In some towns, breaking the statutes could lead to the destruction of the offender's brewing vessels. But although this was actually threatened in 2 statutes in Inverness, it does not appear to have actually been carried out, or if it was not very common. The authorities were very aware that there might be a certain amount of resistance to the conners. Indeed, in 1557, a man had followed the ale tasters through the streets, reproving and scolding them that in doing their office they were, quote, common skemlers, vile, vituperative people, glutton carls, and that they had no other living but harrying poor folk. Perhaps seeking to avoid similar challenges, in 1561, the authorities ordered that anyone who, quote, reproved or abused the ale tasters, they would lose their right to brew for the rest of the year. Now, one aspect that is unique to Inverness is that the authorities also sought to control the production and sale of certain other alcoholic beverages. Occasionally, the town regulated or even forbade the sale of brogget or brogget, which was an ale drink sweetened with honey. When grain supplies were scarce, it was felt malt should be reserved for ale. The other drink was the distilled spirit, which was called aqua vitae or ushkava. Aqua vitae pots, presumably stills, were valuable inheritance goods. There were several producers of aqua vitae in the town, and some brewers of ale also made it. Marion Ogilvy was prosecuted, along with 5 other women and 1 man, for doing so unlawfully in 1577, as this was a privilege reserved to burgesses. In 1579, 16 people were prosecuted, 12 of them women, and then there were more again in 1580. So women's involvement in the whiskey industry actually goes back a very long way. Even burgesses who had the right to make whiskey, though, faced regulation. The authorities ordered that its price had to correspond to the price at which barley or malt was sold. In October 1564, the town tried to restrict the number of producers to 4, but there were such strong protests that in December they backed down, and they allowed those who would agree to keep the stated prices to continue. 10 men and 2 women were then licensed. Now, rules are, of course, made to be broken. And one good thing for later historians is that the town periodically cracked down on those who were breaking the laws and listed them by name. In many towns, not just in Scotland, but elsewhere as well, there are regular lists of brewers who are fined for infractions of the statutes. And historians elsewhere have used these lists to uncover women's work in brewing in England. Some have argued that these regular lists really acted as a de facto licensing system, a cost of doing business. It's not entirely clear that this was the case in Scottish towns, although more work needs to be done on this. The lists there are not regular, the nature of the regulations changed over time, and charges and punishments might vary even within the particular lists. One other aspect of these lists is that they've tended to dominate the discussion of women in brewing. They're nice things to get a hold of, lists of women's names, which are very rare for, and women quite far down the social scale, very rare for this period. But less work is being done on the rest of the lives behind these women. What I've started to do, and I should stress I'm very much at the beginning of this, is to try and find out more about the women whose names appear and to get a somewhat fuller picture of their lives where that's possible. Now, there's a few issues that come up with these lists, especially the issue of names. Many women, including those that we know were married, were identified in some of the lists by their own name only, but many were also identified only as wife of, so wife of John Morrison. This reflected the legal fact that married women's husbands were responsible for paying their debts. Some women appear sometimes under their own name and sometimes as wife of, and this is the case actually for both Elspeth Barnet and Marion Ogilvie. I'm now in the process of identifying where possible who each wife of was by trying to find other mentions of them where they appear with their husbands and both names are given. I already know about these 2 women, and I'm not talking so much about Marion Ogilvie today, but she gave Elspeth Barnet a real run for her money, but there's many more to uncover. Another issue, which is particular to Inverness, is the practice of Gaelic patronymics and nicknames, which were used for about a third of the people in the list. They did not always remain consistent, and some people might appear in different lists in different ways. There's also the issue of how Gaelic names were rendered by Scots-speaking scribes. And as we'll see, this actually tripped me up when I was trying to uncover Elspeth Barnet's marital history. So what I want to do for the rest of the talk is to look at the brewster Elspeth Barnet. What might she have looked like? Well, here is one image of a medieval alewife. This was actually done for the Bannockburn Centre, and in 2012 there was a competition where you could put in your picture to try and see if it might be used for one of the characters. And I did actually put in my image for the alewife, but they didn't choose me. At least I hope that's not me. Let's stick with this one. So what I'd like to talk about with Elspeth is, first of all, her earning of a living, second, her married life with her husbands, which was really a partnership, and then finally, her relations with her neighbors. Now, Elspeth Barnet first appears in the records as a servant of one of the prominent burgesses of the town, Thomas Vos Younger. It was very common for women to become domestic servants, and in their mid-teens and to their early 20s, saving up money to start households of their own. From details that I will come back to later, it appears that Elspeth Barnet was brewing for Thomas Vos at the time. While brewing could be part of their domestic duties, it was also possible for servants to make extra money from this activity, especially by hiring their employer's brewing equipment and paying them with a share of the ale produced. So, for example, one Inverness brewster gave her employer 1 quart or the equivalent price for each batch of ale that she brewed and sold the rest. This probably also helped cut down on servants' wages for the employer. This could be a very profitable arrangement for the women involved. Indeed, in the 1530s, the Edinburgh authorities were so worried that female servants were making enough money that they could set up on their own households as independent single women, something that was both morally suspect and a threat to more established brewers, that they brought in regulations against the practice. Whether Elspeth was hired by Thomas Vos on these terms or not, she certainly put her brewing skills to good use over the next 2 decades. We find her purchasing malt, running an alehouse, and frequently appearing in the lists of unfree brewsters contravening the town regulations in the 1570s. It seems that in later life she tried a change of occupation, as the very last time she appears in these records in 1581, she is one of the town's 11 licensed cake bakers. And I have to admit, when I first came across this, I sort of had visions of, cakes with icing and was wondering about the diet of medieval and early modern people in Scotland. But of course, this means bakers of oat cakes, another occupation that was dominated by women. Husbands and partners. Now, Elspeth was likely unmarried when she was a servant, but sometime, probably in the mid-1560s, she married John Morrison. Unfortunately, there were at least 2 John Morrisons in Inverness, and so it can be a little bit difficult to distinguish them sometimes. But one was a burgess, whereas Elspeth's husband was an indweller of Inverness, i.e. not of burgess status. Indwellers could serve as ale-conners and as officers who were in the lower rungs of local government, however, and it is likely that the John Morrison, who served as a town officer from 1561, was Elspeth's husband. Certainly her second husband served in this capacity. By 1562, John Morrison was made an ale taster, which may have indeed been a good way to become acquainted with Elspeth Barnet. By 1566, they were married. An important aspect of marriage was the economic partnership between husband and wife. The attack on John at Sutherland in 1566 took place in John Morrison's house. Although identified in the records as his house, the alehouse business was likely a joint enterprise, with Elspeth providing the ale and serving the customers. Indeed, a couple months earlier, the couple had jointly purchased malt. By 1568, possibly widowed, Elspeth had the establishment under her own name, as another brawl took place there. Now, running an alehouse was not always smooth sailing, as we have seen. We know about Elspeth's alehouse because of the fight that began there in November 1568. John McFergus and Andrew MacPhail came to blows. It's not clear who started the fight, but John called Andrew a priest bastard, and Andrew gave him a blow on the cheek. John then chased Andrew through the town and into the outskirts, and, said Andrew, if the town watch had not intervened, John would have slain him. Both men were found guilty of troubling the town. McFergus was soon in trouble again. He seems to have rather attracted it. But, or I almost like to think because of this, he had caught Elspeth's eye, and they were married by April 1570 and settled in a house, probably in the Bridgegate. They acted together in business affairs several times. They also jointly got into hot water for usurping burgess privileges by illegally dealing in skins. John promised on his own and Elspeth's behalf that this would not happen again, and he seems to have behaved himself more circumspectly after this, and in 1572 was elected an officer of the town. In early 1574, he was one of the officers ordered to pass through the streets of his part of the town to ensure that people attended the preaching in kirk on Sundays. Control over his wife's actions was not a sure thing, however, and in December 1574, Elspeth was found guilty of illegally going to the countryside and buying malt before it could be brought to the town to be sold, again suggesting that she was very active in the brewing business. Now, what about this third husband, John McFergus? Well, here I have to confess that the scribal rendering of Gaelic names got the better of me for a while. John McFergus appeared before the court in September 1575, but in February 1576, Elspeth appeared before the court with her husband, John McFergus, to pursue a case. My goodness, I thought, she certainly got married again very quickly. Until I realized that the scribe had actually begun to represent John's Gaelic name in a slightly more accurate way, although there were still some slips. But in fact, John McFergus and John McFergus are actually the same man. Husband and wife continued to work together throughout the 1570s, and John was appointed an officer every year from October 1578 until the end of the records. Interestingly, Elspeth only appears as a brewster once more in 1581, and for the first and only time, it's under her husband's name. So far, Elspeth's story has shed light on how women could earn a living and how they worked with their husbands if married. But it's not these aspects of Elspeth's life which brought her to my attention, or indeed to the attention of those few other historians who have made mention of her. It is instead her somewhat fraught relationship with other inhabitants of Inverness. We've already seen her interaction with John at Sutherland in 1566, but although she escaped charges that time, she was not usually the innocent party. We know of several incidents apart from her brewing that saw her on the wrong side of the law. A hint of this comes in the 1566 case when Jasper Dempster pointed out that she had been ordered to be banished earlier and wanted her to be banished again. Although Elspeth first appears in the surviving records in 1559, by that time she had already amassed quite a reputation. A later case mentions that she had been threatened with banishment as early as 1555. Unfortunately, the records start in 1556, so we don't actually have details of why. But this might suggest why, indeed, her first appearance in 1559 also involved discord and violence. So this is when she was a servant. So in October of 1559, a man called Thomas Goy had conceived a violent dislike of Elspeth and gave her serious trouble on a series of occasions. He came to her employer's house where he attacked her, biting her finger and drawing blood. He also waited at night at the gate of the house, armed with a stout stick to hit her. Elspeth was also attacked in the house by Ellen Brackley, who insulted her, calling her a common whore and thief, and then struck her with her employer's mask rudder, suggesting that Elspeth had been in the middle of brewing at the time of the assault. Elspeth was no passive victim, though. She herself was convicted of drawing Thomas Goy's blood. Elspeth appeared before the court again in April 1562. Now, it's not clear what she had done, but apparently it was enough to bring into force the 1555 threat of banishment if she should misbehave in future. She was declared to have been at fault again and was ordered to leave the town within the next month. If she did not take advantage of the opportunity to leave quietly, she would be burned or branded on the cheek and then publicly banished. No mention of public banishment follows, so perhaps she did leave of her own accord. However, the town was not free of her for long, because she was back later that year, and soon before the court again. Perhaps she felt that her former employer, Thomas Vos, had not done much to protect her in 1559, as by this time she had fallen out with him as well. Safely away from his employment, she launched a blistering verbal attack on him. In January 1563, she was convicted of grievously insulting him, saying He would hang himself as his friends did, and drown himself as his sister did. And also that she would have him dead, and that she should burn all his corns, even if they should burn John Ross's corns, and she herself should be burnt for it. Now, as Thomas had been chosen as a deacon of the kirk in 1562, this was a serious assault on a respected burgess of the town. Elspeth was suggesting that his sister and friends were guilty of suicide, a grievous sin. Moreover, she asserted that he could not protect his own crops against her, a slur both on his authority and his masculinity. The town took swift action and ordered her banished again, this time forever. If she tried to come back, she would be branded on the cheek. A public proclamation was to be made at the market cross, so no inhabitant of the town could claim ignorance of her punishment. Moreover, if anyone gave her lodging or received her in the town hereafter, they would be charged as partakers in her crimes. But this was not the last that Inverness was to see of Elspeth Barnet. Within 2 years of her permanent banishment, she was back in the town again. And in November 1564, the authorities, probably quite exasperated by now, ordered her banished again, once again threatening to brand her on the cheek if she returned. It appears that she had friends in the town who had helped her, as once again they ordered that anyone, free or unfree, that received her or helped her would be charged with participating in her offences. Perhaps one of these friends was Marion Ogilvy. And yet again she returned. By April 1566, she had married John Morrison, and later that year she participated in the attack on John at Sutherland. Indeed, it's rather surprising that she was not banished again, especially when Jasper Dempster had called for this. Had the authorities given up on controlling her? Or perhaps they hoped that she might live more peacefully now that she was married? Indeed, she did become somewhat more peaceful. But like the good brewster that she was, she continued to break the trade rules, and we can follow her through the 1570s and early 1580s. Like all other women in towns, although more visible than most, Elspeth Barnet continued to play a vital role in the life of 16th century Inverness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome.
So we can. Does anyone have any questions for Elizabeth? You can either come onto the microphone to ask the questions, or you can pop a question in the chat, and we can come to you that way. Were there any questions that anyone had for Elizabeth about the talk? Derek has a question about whiskey.
Okay.
Come on in, Derek.
Hi, yeah, sorry to ask a question about whiskey when this is about beer, but
No problem.
thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. I've been doing a little bit of work with these records about distilling in
Great.
the 1560s, and inspired, by the way, by your work in Edinburgh.
Oh, thanks.
And one of the things that I can't quite get my head around is the fact that ale was the brewing of ale was mainly about perishability, and that's why it fitted into the economy so well. Whereas aquavita didn't spoil at all. And do you have any? I mean, I've sort of interpreted this as women looking forward quite a lot and acting in a very business-like way. But do you have any of your own? Have you sort of gone into that aspect of the economy in Inverness?
That's a really good point, actually. I hadn't actually thought about comparing the sustainability of it. I know that so the brewsters were not brewing making of whiskey was supposed to be just a privilege of the burgesses. So most of the women that I'm looking at in my records don't have that privilege, and so they they show up just because they're doing it and they're not supposed to do it. And now that you mention it, I think something I could look at is whether the women that there's not that many of them. I'm talking about the unfree brewsters at this point, but I could have a look at whether the women who are charged with that, who are people like Mary and Ogilvy, actually are possibly the ones that do appear to be the most professional of the brewsters, which might suggest that they would have the networks for selling, and so that this would be a very profitable sideline for them. Where the people are licensed, they are burgesses, and in fact, I think there's one woman who claimed that she should be allowed to do this because she had a burgess right, which was somewhat dicey. You probably know the case. And what struck me there, what was interesting about that was the number of women actually involved. But that's a really good point about the
There were
difference
40.
between the two with the perishability. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there were 40 women at one point distilling whiskey. It's loads.
40.
Yeah. But no, thank you so much. It's a really nice bit of continuity of people making whiskey being complete scallywags. So,
yes. And ale. when was the 40? Was that in the 16th century or in the 17th?
When you were going through your talk there, I was looking for my notes, and my disorganization is a problem. But it was in the 1560s, I think.
Oh, right. I'd be really interested. Would you mind maybe emailing me?
I'll email you with what I've got. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. Thanks so much. Thank you.
And then I think we have a question from Fergus.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Fergus.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks. That was fascinating.
Thanks.
You mentioned that the majority of people involved, of brewsters, were women, and my question is twofold. Do you know if that was typical? If Inverness was typical in that regard, in the time period you're looking at, or was it unusual? And secondly, when did that stop and why?
Right. Two excellent questions. First one's easy to answer. No, Inverness was not at all atypical in this. In every town where there are records surviving, the vast majority of the brewers are women, which is, as I said, the good thing about this is it gives us an insight into those women that are below the level of the elite. So, for example, in Aberdeen, in around late 15th century, there's a list of about 99 of them. In Edinburgh in the 1530s, I think there's 40 to 50, and the lists they're long lists, and for a women's historian coming across these things is, oh my gosh. So Inverness was absolutely typical in that. The second question, oh yes, I didn't really have time to go into this. So the argument that has been made for England is that the thing that changed this was the introduction of hops. And so because, and this is the argument that's being made for medieval English brewing, is that with the introduction of hops, ale, or as it tends to be called with hopped beer, can be preserved much longer, and therefore it can become a much larger scale operation. And so it can expand dramatically in size, and it comes professional and full-time. And all of those are characteristics which make it more of a male profession than a female profession. So it's sort of gone out of the domestic industry scale into this larger commercial scale. And it's true that in 1596, I think it is, you get the Society of Brewers established in Edinburgh. And you also get more sort of commercialized malt kilns areas in the meadows. And it seems that this is probably happening in Scotland as well, but at a somewhat later period than in England. In England, it's sort of dated to the late 15th and 16th centuries. In Scotland, probably this process goes on in the 17th century, but as none of the people, there's two of us who've been working on brewers, none of us have looked at the 17th century. However, if Rebecca Mason is still in the audience, I'm hoping that she's going to be able, she's now looking at the Inverness records for the 17th century. And I've been talking with her about this and whether this does actually happen. We really need to trace the story forward. It's possible that in Scotland, the small-scale domestic ale industry continued for longer, but it does seem to have been the sort of technological change that changed it. Ian Donaghy's History of the Brewing Industry, yep, there we go. He really starts the story. He has a little bit about the period before 1700, but not that much, partly because the research hasn't been done on it yet. So I think the 17th century could be the crucial clue, but I think it's technological change or changes in the brewing process that lead to this change.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks very much. And Rebecca has actually asked a question in the chat. I think she's ill. Would you like to come in, Rebecca, or would you like me to read that? I'll read it out. It says, great talk, Elizabeth, and I must admit I also trip up on Gaelic names. I have a question about banishment. Do you know where Elspeth went when she was banished? And do you think she relinquished her rights to her husband's property or payments upon banishment? I was just wondering how banished women managed to carve out a life for themselves on the margins, and whether or not they could be whether they could lawfully claim property as a wife or widow.
Yes, okay, good questions. My suspicion is that I don't know for sure when Elspeth married John Morrison. My suspicion is that it might have been not long before 1566 when she was back, so she wasn't actually banished when she was a wife, and possibly this is why she wasn't banished in 1566, although we do find some other cases of wives being banished. We don't know where she went. I suspect that from the fact that she was out buying malt illegally in the countryside a little bit later on suggests that she probably had contacts in the countryside and probably would have been able to stay there. I think if wives were if wives were banished, it's not entirely clear what their legal position was. We do find in some other towns wives being banished and husbands sort of having to give surety that they won't bring them back and that they'll make sure they stay banished. So it's almost as though banishment, if you were married, would remove those safeguards of being married. The problem about banishment is that there are so many records that say, if you do this again, you'll be banished. If you do this again, you'll be banished. And often it's the same person. If you do this again, you'll be banished. Okay, you've done it again. But if you do it again, you'll be banished. Okay. But if you do it again, you'll be banished. So when you first look at the records, it looks like banishment is happening all the time. And certainly in other towns in this period, it's regularly used. But I've done some work on banishment recently, and it's surprising how rarely it actually occurs. It's threatened all the time. But it's almost never carried out. And then when it is carried out, even when it's ostensibly forever, if we are able to trace these people, they're usually back in the town within a couple of years. So there must be some process going on by which they can be forgiven and brought back, or else they come back. They have enough of a network to support them, although this would be more likely in larger towns. There's been some work done on banishment in Canongate in the 17th century that shows these sort of networks of support that women have. And so they come back again. So it does, the medieval and early modern law like to really threaten severe punishments. And an older generation of historians used to talk about how brutal the law was and cite these. But when you actually look at what's actually happening, most of these are threats rather than actually carried out. The burning of the cheek, for example, that she's threatened with twice. I think there might be one or two instances where this actually was carried out. but it's threatened all the time. So banishment, I think it's really interesting because it shows us how the medieval law is working, but it also shows us the limits of how it can be put into place. Thanks.
Thanks very much. David, you had a question as well?
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly, that was wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Really
Thanks.
brought 16th century Inverness to life. And my question is about sources. I was really interested in your point at the start, and I wondered what your opinion was on William Mackay's editing after having used that and then going back to the original sources and the transcriptions. I've been using Mackay's editing or referring to that in a different context a lot recently. And I think it's extraordinary what he did. He is a founder of the Gaelic Society of Inverness and an amazing scholar. But what does he leave out?
So when there are a few places where he, and I'm not meaning this as a criticism of him, it's just the way that he's chosen to do that. There are a few places where he's left out parts of an entry. And so it gives the wrong impression. So in fact, he doesn't, the case that I began with, he doesn't give all the parts of that case. And it rather looks, I think I recall, it looks in the records as though Elspeth was banished. But in fact, when you go back to the records, you find out that she wasn't. So occasionally there's misleading things like that. Where I checked his transcription against the original, it's pretty good. I think there's been one or two. One of the, and maybe you would know the answer to this. So one of the things when I first came across this was, so this transcript is not, it doesn't say who did it. It was done between 1899 to 1901, and I'm not sure if it was him or not, because there are some slight differences between the transcript and the printed version. Some words are rendered in different ways. So is this him changing his mind about how the word should be rendered, or is this a different person who did the transcript? And if anybody knows about, if anybody has examples of his handwriting compared against the transcripts, that would be, you know, we could identify if it was him who actually did it. I mean, so Inverness records are published in 1911. So, and
just to say, I do have examples of his handwriting, Elizabeth, so I'll send them to you.
Okay, yeah. I mean, one thing that in the transcripts, there are also later notes saying which sort of indicate which ones are going to go into the. They seem to indicate which ones are going into the published version, and the handwriting seems a little bit different. So if you can come to the bottom of that, that would be great. At the previous, the archivist of Inverness records in 2002, Bob, sorry, I've forgotten his last name. He and I were trying to puzzle out exactly who had written these transcripts. So I would be interested to know that. The sorts of things he does, of course, with the lists, he does, from my perspective, what he's missed. He gives some of the lists, but not others. He'll say, and 32 names follow, which is not terribly helpful. And he leaves out a lot of the sort of bread and butter debt cases, which if you're trying to find out about life in general, I think that's really important. And again, specifically from this, a number of the references to Elspeth Barnet don't show up in the records of Inverness. Enough do that they've attracted people's attention. But as I hope I've shown, there's an awful lot more to show. So that there's a lot more about women in the Inverness records than you would get in just the records of Inverness. Having said all that, though, I think it's an excellent source, and you know, and his introduction to it, which he then published separately, as well as Life in Inverness in the 16th century, is a wonderful introduction to. It really gives a great introduction to 16th century Inverness. I think I disagree with a few of the things that he says, because there are a couple of things where he says, well, for example, he said, oh, anybody who was caught breaking the brewing offences would have their cauldron hauled to the market cross and broken. And in fact, it does say that in one of the statutes, but there's very little evidence of that actually happening. He also talks about, he said women's scolds were branded on the cheek with a fleur-de-lis. There's one instance of that happening, and I'm still trying to sort out what that means. And I'm wondering actually if it is actually the town seal, which did have a lily on it. But there's only one instance of that, so it's not the common punishment for. He's sort of doing what I was criticizing some other historians for doing, is taking the statutes at face value and saying, oh, if they say this is going to happen, that must have happened. So that can be a little bit misleading. But I still think it's a wonderful resource. And I think it's been really good for local historians too, because it's there. And, it has been made a lot of use of. But let me know what you find out. Oh, and thank you also for recommending Victoria Whitbread to me to get the records for me. That has been extremely helpful, especially in the days of COVID. So.
Thanks very much. I think we've got Jonathan, you had a comment.
Well, actually, just on this last thing, is it possible for someone to scan these pages of the transcript and turn it into a PDF so that it could actually be accessible? I would think David might take an initiative on that through the archive.
It would, if the archives were agreeable. I have digital images that were taken for me, but they were taken with permission for me to be able to use them. But I think it would be a wonderful resource if the archives were willing to give permission for that to be done. I say David might be the best
it would be
person.
available to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was really commenting because you name checked me, and I actually looked at my report from 1979, and there is a kiln in the 15th century that could potentially have been a malting, but there was a bit of lead found there, so there was a suggestion it might have had a different use.
Yeah, I noticed that Michael Spearman was very cautious about ascribing any particular function to that, but I think it certainly is possible that it could have been, given the Inverness records charters of the period that do talk about kilns. So it's really nice to meet you, actually. Yours was one of the first archaeological reports I read when I was a student.
I was also going to say I actually helped at the beginning of the excavation in Church Street, and there was a talk as part of the Highland Archaeology Festival, which will be going online eventually on the YouTube channel.
Oh, wonderful.
It's only a half-hour thing, and they haven't had the processing of that. One of the problems with archaeology is getting precision and dating materials. The later material, it seemed to be, there were certainly hearths turned up, but to try and prove whether they were actually for malting or for brewing is going to be more difficult to prove, and they haven't had all the analysis done yet. So you'll have to wait a year or two before that. But you could contact AOC, Lindsay Sterling. I think it's Lindsay.Sterling at AOC. If you look on their website, I think you'll find that.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've only read the reports in the BBC story about it, but
so it's AOC Archaeology.
AOC Archaeology. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, my original, I'm not an archaeologist, but my thesis work attempted to bring together archaeology and history to look at Scottish towns, and so I've always been interested in the archaeology aspect of it, and a lot of the work that I did at that time was from reports that weren't yet published and things. So it'd be great to get access to material like that again. So thank you so much, and thank you for the work you did on Castle Street.
Well, that was my job, but
I
was going to make a comment that it was my understanding that drinking beer, that was your standard drink, small beer. The water was so unreliable that everyone would be brewing to some extent.
Yeah, it really was a staple good, which is why it was so regulated. So the brewing process in itself would help to make the water healthier, but it also gave you this caloric intake as well. So that's why ale and bread were the two staples. So yeah, it's easy to make jokes about drinking drinking it as a sort of alcoholic fun beverage, but in fact it was a crucial beverage for everybody. You're quite right there, and I think that's why it's so crucial. And I would argue that that's one of the ways that women's work was so crucial to the medieval and early modern town. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And we have another question from Susan, who was asking, did families have their own recipes, or did it depend on what was available in terms of what went into the beer, or is that something we wouldn't be able to know?
What a great question. I think the short answer is we don't have any surviving recipes, but so I'd have to surmise here, but I would say that if the way that the knowledge is passed on is largely from mother to daughter, I suspect that there probably were family recipes that were passed on. Of course, it would also depend on what sort of flavorings were available. So that also, actually, just talking about Inverness being different from other places, that which I haven't looked into that aspect of it, but that might mean that the ale tasted different in different towns depending on what sort of additives there were. I know that mostly English travelers were absolutely scathing about the quality of ale and beer in Scotland right into the 18th century. They thought it was absolutely terrible stuff. So this is not a high quality beverage, but that's really interesting. I wonder if possibly later on, and maybe in the 17th and 18th centuries, you might start to get recipes that would indicate, if there's household books, they might possibly indicate. Unfortunately, for the 16th century, the only records that we have are basically the ones that I put before you. But my informed speculation would be that probably there's probably family recipes for how to do it, which might change over time. I suppose if you opened up an ale house too, you might gradually alter depending on the tastes of your customers. So Charlotte's saying there are recipes for, okay, from the 16th century? Sorry. 17th century, yeah. But I suspect that the fact that they exist in the 17th century, I suspect there are recipes that would go back into the 16th century.
May I just comment on something there?
Mm-hmm.
There are in a book called The Science and Commerce of Whiskey, there's a list of publications, some of which are as old as the 16th century, written quite often by women and for women.
Interesting.
With some of them have recipes and some of them are online. I've not looked into them very deeply, but I expect if there are beer recipes, they'll be there as well.
And this is for Scottish whiskey in Scotland?
Yeah, the book is The Science and Commerce of Whiskey, and there's a sort of, it's not really a big part of the book, but there is a breakdown of, I think, 30 or so books written between the 16th and 19th century.
Really?
Yeah, I've got a list of them. I can send you it.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, I don't want to trespass on your area of research, but I'm interested really interested to hear about this.
I've got far too much to do anyway.
Thank you. I don't, are there any further questions? Because I did have a little personal thing I thought I might just share with you I don't know if there's any other questions.
I think I can just see one further question. It was just a follow on to Rebecca's question. It was saying that if Elspeth was, when she was banished, could she have moved along to somewhere like Dingwall to ply her trade? So it was more of a comment than a question. But I think that was all we've got at the moment. So yes, come back in, Elizabeth.
Well, yeah. So I because we've had to move things around in our house recently. I was explaining this to Lucy. I was wondering, I've been sort of wondering why I've been so attracted by Elspeth Barnet, you know, what it is about her that attracts me. And obviously the law breaking is one. But I then, and, you know, and then I got interested in brewing. And one of the things I uncovered was, which I was in the back of my mind, but I totally forgotten about it, was that when I was a student, one of my friends and I decided that we would break into the male world of brewing. And there was a brewing contest for homemade beer, and it was almost entirely dominated by men. So we thought, well, it's time. So we actually developed our own beer, and we actually even developed our own label. And I don't know if you can see this, but we developed our own t-shirts as well. And the product was called Scottish Swill. I thought about wearing this, but then decided that it might not be formal enough. I have to report that we did not win. However, we did win for best label. So in fact, it turns out that I have been a Scottish woman brewer for most of my life, and this must be my attraction. So.
That's brilliant, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk that sparked lots of interesting questions today. And I just wanted to add that our next History Talks live talk is Dr. Emma Newlands on Thursday, the 18th of November, and you can find out more information about that on the website. And I'd just like everybody to put their hands together again and thank Elizabeth for her time and her research and sharing her research with us.
Well, thanks so much for your interest.